I'll get started with the introduction so that we have enough time for the panel conversation. So welcome everyone to the CXPA Calgary Network event. Today's event is Human-Centric Design During Critical Times. I'm Jumur Chaudhary, one of the founding members of the CXPA Calgary Network. For those of you who have not attended a CXPA event before today, CXPA is the Customer Experience Professional Organization, which was founded in 2011. Really, CXPA helps to advance the CX discipline by recognizing, inspiring, and supporting CX excellence. It started in the US, but today it has presence in more than over 70 countries. Our Calgary network is about 1.5-year-old. It was founded by a bunch of us. I know Jackie is on the call here. Jackie and I started the initial conversation with CXPA. Then Umar joined us, and we have a few other volunteers. Our network is 1.5 years old, but we love the community support we have got here in Calgary. We have hosted 6 events, including today's, and we have had around more than 20 thought leaders join us in the process and over 300 participants. When times were normal, we used to have in-person event. We really enjoyed having those conversations in the room. We had to pivot in May, and we had our first webinar. This is our second webinar series, and there's some advantages in that as well, because what this way of getting the community together has helped us do is expand beyond Calgary networks. So we are in the process of connecting with the other 4 networks in Canada, and we have attended each other's events. So we are evolving towards a CXPA Canada network to advance the CXPA discipline in Canada. For finding out more about CXPA, and Umar will walk us through a little bit after the panel discussion, you can check out cxpa.org. Now coming to today's topic, we have, which is human-centric design in critical times. How does design thinking apply to CX and EX? Design thinking is simply a creative problem-solving method. The key ingredient of this is the human-centered process. And we know design thinking is a breeding ground for empathy. And we have seen extensive use of design thinking in product design and in the UX space, because it's easy to recognize a product which has users' needs in mind versus one that doesn't. However, design thinking techniques can be used to find solutions in various areas. And in today's session, we will learn practical tips from experts to see how it can be applied to service design to apply employee experience beyond what we are traditionally used to seeing. So today, Corey Davison from For Experience has graciously agreed to moderate the panel for us. A little bit about Corey and For Experience. For Experience is a full-service research and experience management firm focused on connecting silos of data and people to generate improved experience and measurable business outcomes. Corey has worked with companies like Shopify Plus, Tabbank, Benevity. They rely on For Experience's expertise. And Corey is an expert researcher who is committed to helping companies use research to create human-centric experience. And over the past 2 decades, she has been in leadership roles with companies such as Toyota, Ipsos Reid, and more recently, she led the VOC program at Smart Technologies to set it up. So with that, over to you, Corey, to get us started with the panel.
Thank you very much, Jumur, and thank you for everyone who has joined us today for this time. If you're in Calgary, I see we have audience from all across North America, so and probably beyond. So if you're in Calgary, I hope you're enjoying your lunch and learn here too. And kudos to you for taking this time to pause a little bit on your day and learn. So I am really excited about the topic today, because if you're here, you probably agree with me that as companies around the world are now transitioning to serving both employees and customers in how to change, right? And how to access goods and services and how to work remotely. And with the acceleration of digital experiences, human-centric design has never been more critical than now. Would you agree with that? Please use the chat as well. And also share where you're from. I see some of you. We want this to be an interactive session. So if you have comments, questions, interact using the chat button as well. So a little bit about myself and why I'm so interested in this topic is over a couple of decades of working in research on different departments. And I've been working with marketing, with human resources, customer experience, user experience, so many roles. What I have actually learned on the job and observed is that oftentimes we start research with objectives in mind, with the purpose of creating better outcomes. And however, many times we end up focusing on metrics, on processes, on statistics, and we forget about that human element in the human story. We get caught into those deliverables, right? So today we're going to pause a little bit and dive a little bit more about how to build more of those stories and bring to light the human-centric design in everything that we do, whether it is even designing a survey, right? Or whether it is, changing an entire process. And who better to share that than two individuals who are involved in change management right now and in service design. So what we want for everyone who's here listening to this to achieve at the end of this session is that you would have gained a little bit of more knowledge, or perhaps just refreshing or adding something new to your toolkit that you will bring back to your organization so that you can implement some of this human-centric design thinking as well. So today I have the pleasure and honor of interviewing two fantastic human beings, because we're talking about the human-centric design. So I have Jacqueline Brieux and Natalie Ilkew and we're going to be talking on the topic of human-centric design for crisis situations. Okay, so I want to first make a note that their opinions are personal and not representative of what the companies that they work for. Let me share a little bit about their background, and then we'll dive into the topic. Okay, so I'm going to start with Jacqueline. So Jacqueline is originally from Toronto, and now she lives in Virginia. She is a human-centered design leader who has spent the last decade helping organizations improve the human experience end to end and back to front. I love that, right? It's kind of like a 360. And she currently leads service design at Shopify, where she helps cross-functional teams adopt new ways of thinking and working to drive a better experience for merchants around the world. She has also worked for companies like Fannie Mae and Capital One, implementing service design. And I also have the pleasure of introducing Natalie Ilkew. She is a change advisor at WestJet. She specializes in developing and implementing change management strategies to help leaders and employees effectively navigate and adopt change. So, and this is where human-centric design is so important too. So she has worked in healthcare industries for over 7 years and helping improve patient experience in different organizations. So as we go through their stories, what you will learn from their experience is two very different circumstances. Here's the thing. We have on one end, Jacqueline with Shopify, who's in a company that's undergoing tremendous growth, even during this crisis. And on the other hand, as many of you know, the aviation industry has been dramatically hurt during this current crisis. And Natalie will share with us also what is WestJet doing to manage this crisis and to keep the human at the center as well. So please, again, I encourage your comments on the chat. And I'd like to start, with this, with asking Jacqueline first, how did you, if you can tell us a little bit about your role and how did you become interested in service design?
Sure. So yeah, thanks for having me, Corey. So right now I'm a service design manager at Shopify. I actually work on our support team. So when I started, I had worked with Shopify Plus, which is more of our enterprise side of things, but now I'm focused on our frontline service delivery. We have over 2,000 frontline workers distributed across the globe, all of whom work remotely. So that there presents a unique challenge and an opportunity. And maybe I'll just jump in for one point, but one of the things I've been evangelizing or advocating for since I first got into user experience, more formally in 2012, but I started noticing that there was a separation between the sales teams and the support teams, and then the marketing teams and the design teams, and like all of this data was sort of siloed within each of these divisions. And from early on, when I was like the first UX designer at a startup in Toronto called Uberflip, I was going, because we had an open office space of, at the time, probably like 25 people. And I would go over to the support team and I would ask them to like go over their Zendesk notes and hear about their calls and stuff. So a lot of that experience is kind of coming forward now to Shopify, which is a much larger organization that I believe now has over 7,500 employees. And when I started, it was like 4,000. So, but I'm still seeing, you know, this sort of separation between all of the insight that's captured in support that is not necessarily utilized by other parts of the organization. And so that's something I've been trying to evangelize. And yeah, but I started in service design when I was at Capital One. I was just fortunate to be there when they had acquired Adaptive Path. And so the first, I want to say like, the first several weeks of my time there, we had a design thinking boot camp. And so all of the members, not all, but those who signed up, there's probably a handful of folks from Adaptive Path who were in the room for this 4-day boot camp. And so I just kind of became friends with several of them and got talking more about service design. And I had the great privilege to work with Jamin Hegeman and Chris Risden and Patrick Quattlebaum, all of whom are really tremendous thought leaders in this space. And Kristen Skinner was there at the time, who with Peter Merholtz has sort of led a lot of the thought leadership around design, org design for design orgs. And it's just also the title of the book that they co-authored. But yeah, and then Steph Hay for content strategy. So I mean, Capital One, I was there during the heyday of like everyone who was leading content strategy, design operations, service design as 3 sort of core like emerging disciplines. And so I latched on to service design and ended up working for Chris Risden with Capital One Labs and started implementing some service design methodology in what I do. I didn't have a formal title of service design until I went to Fannie Mae and I was hired there to start up their service design practice. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you for the background, Jacqueline. And I love that we'll be talking about those silos as well, right? And how that impacts that. So thank you for bringing up. Please feel free to keep commenting on the chat for everyone listening and sharing also how do you relate to what we're talking about here too. So with that, Natalie, can you please share with us a little bit about your role and how it changed during this current crisis as well?
For sure. So my job as a change advisor, change management is really looking at how can we encourage people to accept change. You can have the best solution in the world, but if you can't get your people on board to actually accept it, it's not going to be functional. You're not going to get the same outcomes that you're hoping for. So at WestJet, my job is to help people accept the changes that are going on. And it's definitely been a hard time at WestJet, especially like you mentioned earlier with the aviation industry being hit so hard. One thing that's general about the crisis right now is that there's a lot of uncertainty. It's extended for a lot of time, but I think especially at WestJet, there's a lot of uncertainty going on. So our role really transitioned to how can we be more agile and how can we better support our people through this change. People's tolerance for change is a lot less. If you think about the average individual, when you're trying to work through a crisis, you kind of revert back to your basic needs. Instead of looking at how you're going to progress through and move your career, you're really just trying to survive till the next day. So people's needs are a lot different. We've had to learn how to figure out what those needs are. And with everything we do, we need to be a little bit more quicker because information is coming so quick. There's a lot of changes, so figuring out different methodologies that we can use to support people from this. So making sure that information is up to date and it's accurate, and we're not overwhelming them with all the changes that are coming through.
So definitely, thank you, Natalie, and definitely this emphasizes, a huge case where the human-centric design plays a big role. And especially where change is so drastic as well. You mentioned also the first thing that you needed to do was also to figure out what they need. Can you share a little bit with us about, what techniques or how do you go and figure out, right? We have probably many people in the audience who are also trying to figure out how to cope with change, right? So where do you get started if you're a leader?
Definitely. And that's a good question. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go about doing that. At WestJet, one of the biggest challenges is we have a very remote workforce. So there's people across the country. We have individuals who are at corporate working at their desk. There's people who are flying airplanes and all they have is a tablet and they don't have 24/7 access to internet. So we needed to find different ways that we could actually get input from our employees. So one of the things that we set up right when COVID hit was an internal site where we could have a Q&A that was ongoing and employees could submit their questions and their concerns. We had a full team that was working behind the scenes, processing that, making sure that any questions that came up were quickly posted on the site. And that was a really good method because, like I mentioned earlier, people can't always just call up their leaders. So they had a method that they could actually submit questions to and receive a response. Another thing that we've started to leverage, and this takes a little bit more time to build up, but we've created our change agent network. And this is individuals who've received a little bit of training on what it is like to be in change management, what we do, and they're across the entire organization. So we have pilots, we have contact center employees, leaders, and if we ever have a change that's going through, we have these contacts that we can reach out to and give them a quick survey to ask them how they've been feeling about the change and even to extend it into their group and get a pulse check on what's going on. So one survey we sent out was just like 3 short questions, like have you felt supported about the change? Have you felt informed about these changes and what could be done differently?
So important for all of those folks on this call who are on employee experience. This is so relevant as well, right? And how that ultimately is connected to the customer experience, right? When we look at that, as you see here in my banner, this cross of different silos, right? And this is definitely, I love the idea that you're doing, creating more of like disseminating, or of like not having to own all of it. You're using other teams and other representatives to help you with the change as well. Is that correct? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really helpful when you can get that information because kind of like on the whole foundation of user design is like you're building a product for the people. And in some ways, that's what you're trying to do with change management is you're building the support systems that these people need. So whether it's a different type of communication or a different type of training, it's kind of coming from the same principles, really building it from the ground up.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. And Jacqueline, how about in your case? Like again, you're on the other side of adapting to tremendous growth at Shopify, right? Which still impacts the employees and remote workers. How are you handling right now or using service design during this crisis at Shopify? Can you help us understand a little bit of what tactics are you using?
Yeah, it's interesting just because I think between March and now, I mean, we were already growing quite fast, but and we had sort of before the pandemic, there was this effort to regionalize our service delivery. Our support team had sort of been organized by function. And so we had, our escalated support team, our sort of tier 1 first, like just generic advisor support team. If you call in, you're going to get that team. And then we have a bunch of like theme support and financial services support and technical support. And like, it keeps going. We have all these specialties. And the idea we have, I mean, it's funny, this is sort of a bit of Shopify, but we have our at the time, our chief support officer had this obsession with pro-social. And that was a large part of where the regionalization effort was coming from, was his interest in applying pro-social philosophy to our support team. So I think in very, very simplistic description of that is just to create these smaller, more connected teams, and regionalization being a part of that. So there was a little bit more of shared context. And so teams felt a little bit more connected. And so that is definitely like an employee experience side of things. They were working with a company called Ethical Systems to try to measure the employee experience, to try to validate this experiment of regionalization. And they just started with New York as a pilot. And so go ahead. I thought you were going to. And so The interesting thing though is that we didn't necessarily hire folks who were co-located in New York. We just had frontline, service folks who were distributed across different time zones. So we have folks mostly distributed between like Ottawa, Galway in Ireland, and then I want to say Christchurch, New Zealand. And so we've got these three, and so they sort of do this follow the sun model where we can have folks sort of be there 24/7. And so we had folks servicing New York, but they're not from New York, but they're sort of part of this, like, it was oriented around where our customers are focused. Now, one of the things that adds complexity to that is the fact that as you get more and more complex as a small business, some businesses will then expand to new regions. And so I was sort of like thinking about, well, what happens if you're based in New York, you're headquartered there, but then you open an office in Sydney or you open an office in London, but we have this New York regionalized team. How do we service that? And so there's all these, there are just complexities in the regionalization model. But the thing was, right after the pandemic hit, they just paused the whole thing, and it was like an abrupt like we had the whole company was like our own support was entirely focused on regionalization. Everyone was like, all your projects need to tie into regionalization somehow. And the thing that always a little bit bothered me was that it always felt like an assumption. Like we were pouring all this research and resources into this one C-level executive's sort of, like fixation with pro-social and his like assumption that this was going to work. And so everyone was anchoring toward that rather than it coming from, oh, we're hearing insights from the front lines about people and these are the things that they need. I've been trying to get more and more executives to stop making assumptions and stop pouring resources into assumptions and to start finding these reliable data sources to try to inform some of the strategic direction. And the unfortunate thing is if you don't have these reliable data sources that go end to end or that are representative of different subsets of your customers, then it's really hard for you to make those informed decisions. You end up having to overinvest in research that is a bit more specific and more tailored to really understand that segment. And so if organizations aren't set up to have this data sort of coming in and to make sense out of it and to be able to like map it to your customer, regardless of their touch point, or inclusive of all touch points, I should say, then you're shooting in the dark. And I think in a lot of companies, especially a company like Shopify that has grown so fast, there is this sort of allergic reaction to time. It's like, no, it's going to take too long. We have to just like do it now. And so, it's almost like we need to invest in some of these really foundational, infrastructure, like these systems that allow us to make more human-centered decisions and allow us to service our customers in a more human-centered way. But there is this reluctance to doing that because we have to move fast because it's about the mission. It's about, making commerce better for everyone. And it's, so I'm trying to think of what we've pivoted to. So I think it's now very public, but Digitize Canada is one effort. So Shopify immediately started looking at business associations and partnering with local governments to try to help small businesses get online. And so we worked with the government of Canada. This is sort of out of my purview, but I'm very aware of it because it was updated. These were updated in our all hands and our AMAs. But Canada was the starting. It's still happening right now, but we're trying to work with the Digitize Canada was focused on helping small businesses that historically just had brick and mortar shops,
right?
And allowing them to and then the second part of that was hiring. We needed more, like our support team was just getting hammered with with a bunch of calls. And so at one point they actually shut off inbound calls. It was sort of like an abrupt, like we have to shut off calls. We're going to migrate everyone to chat because we can handle 3 chats at once instead of 1 call at once. And then, and that was a bit of a disaster. So then they switched to making outbound calls and allowing people to request that we call them. And that was a bit of a nice intermediary. But the thing that they did to resolve the burden on our phones and chats and emails was working with the government of Canada to subsidize hiring, I think it was 1,000 apprentices, like guru, like advisor apprentices. And they specifically focused on remote locations within Canada because we are a distributed company and they wanted to allow folks in small towns to get work. So yeah, there's, I mean, I can go into more detail if anyone's curious, but
so interesting because
I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacqueline. You touched on many topics here of interest, and again, that impact on not only how do we adapt, to change on, as Natalie was just sharing, when things are not going the direction that you had planned, right? And then on the other hand, also is more about what is the cause and effect of different tactics that you have to act quickly on them, right? So Natalie, you mentioned, for example, in your, when you were briefing us on your current situation, you also referenced that it's like you have to act quickly when there's a crisis. And I'm reading one of the principles here about design for crisis principles, and one of them says, respond to change quickly, right? When your users need it. Tell me about how do you do it, and what are the challenges that come with that as well?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's something that is we're always working on refining that and making sure people are aware and informed of these changes. The biggest challenge has just been like accuracy of information, because we have information coming in so quickly. So how do we make sure that people are aware of these changes and they're getting in the right way at the right time with the right amount of information that we need? So I talked a little bit earlier how we had a centralized site where everybody could access. It was more pull information rather than pushing emails out all the time. Because if we think about how many changes have happened since March, like even just the public health guidelines have changed so quickly and even within the day. So we had a site where people could go and they could actually access that information. Everybody in the company knew that this was the single source of truth, and that's where they could find this information. So really directing everyone to that site was helpful. And then the other piece that I think was really crucial was focusing on our leaders and making sure that they were informed and had the capacity to support their employees. Because if an employee has a question, you can submit it through the site, but there might be some things that are more personal or they have more specific impacts on their work and their life. So we set up these webinars for our leaders, and we'd meet every 2 weeks, or we'd have little focus groups, and we talk about the challenges that were going on, the common questions that were coming up. And these groups had leaders from all different areas of the business, so you could share what was going on in one area versus the other, trying to break down those silos and give strategies for what they could actually advise to their employees.
That sounds like a really comprehensive strategy, right? Like to just keep the voices coming. It's how I hear it. Now, is that something that you find that it's new? Is that something that was implemented, or that you just had to enhance? Is it something that you had to adapt?
That was new that came out. We'd have, I guess, less frequent meetings with all of the leaders, but when we really broke it down into smaller focus groups and increased the frequency. So that was something that was new. And now that things have somewhat stabilized, we found that there's actually a need for that to continue on. So we've started engaging our leaders going forward. We're going to start back up the webinars, and we've created a channel for them to submit topics of concern. So we can theme them and address all the main topics when we do have these sessions going forward.
And that might be part of the challenge as well, right, Natalie? When you have collected all of this information, then you have to do something with it, right? You have to analyze it, and then you have to drive some action with it. What are some things that you are using, or how are you processing all of those insights? I see, for example, I'm just going to refer to the chat here, as I see Keith is sharing, for example, that there is sometimes too many interpreters of information. Of course, you're listening from leaders and everyone in the front line, but they might not be experts in interpreting it. And how do you manage those situations, for example?
Yeah, and that's, I think, always one of the biggest challenges. What we've tried to do is leverage technologies so you can see it. So it's not like an open channel where everybody can see what's going on. And that helps you theme things and focus on what is really important. So if it's something that comes off across multiple leaders and we know that this is an area that needs more help, But if it's more of a one-off situation, then you might reach out to that individual separately. We've also used the platform Thought Exchange. So this is, we've held like all company webinars and town halls, and these you can submit questions and people can vote on the questions to see if this is something that's truly popular and people actually want to hear about. And then we'll theme those questions and prep them before we actually share.
Thank you. Yes, and one of the common things that we have been hearing as a side effect of this crisis has been the mental health, of course, right, of individuals, and whether, people who have been laid off or who are still working, or perhaps someone in your family is affected, right, and all of these things. When you're referencing also these leaders and empowering them, to listen and bring that up, oftentimes our studies indicate that it's that middle management or the leaders who are suffering the most because they're kind of in a crunch, right? Representing an audience and then reporting to the executives too. So what kind of techniques would you share that would be advisable, to support individuals? And I know, you've had some employee fatigue experts, for example, Nicole, who is going to join us here in the panel as well, unfortunately couldn't join us today. But what are some techniques that you use to keep a tab and support individuals, keeping that human-centric, again, on getting the job done, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, well, one of the things that WestJet is very supportive of is our mental health promotion. So we have a lot of programs that we've leveraged throughout this and have even extended if people are on leave, we've extended these mental health benefits to them. So whether it's online counseling, we have some programs called Not Myself Today, so directing managers, employees on how to access that material. And then I think it goes back to the groups that we've set up with the leaders and the focus groups. So each focus group will be led by a more senior leader. And so they have the support of everyone else to talk about, and you can have these smaller candid conversations and actually talk about what's really going on versus like a giant town hall where you have all the leaders. If you have 3 or 4 in this smaller pod, it's the same pod every week. So you kind of get to build those relationships and actually talk about what's really going on. So I think that's been helpful for people to build those relationships and have that support.
Okay. And do you believe that how is this going to reflect in the future? For example, let's say a decade from now, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
That might be a little bit more of a stretch, but what do you think is going to remain as part of your process going forward?
Yeah, I think, well, these leader focus hubs have been, we've gotten feedback that everyone really likes them and find them helpful. I think one of the mandates that we're trying to focus on is really empowering our leaders because as I talked about before, if an employee doesn't understand why a change is happening or what's going on, they're not going to accept that and adopt it. So we need to make sure that the leaders have the resources and the support they need. So I think this will be not only a good avenue for leaders to talk about the challenges that they're experiencing with the change and problem solve around it, but it's also another avenue for us to provide more training and more context and figure out where those gaps are when we implement change. So I think that'll be a huge thing going forward. And then shifting a little bit away from the leaders, I talked about that site that we used, and we use it as our single source of truth. So that's something that we've already started to apply to other projects. We've noticed like our internal sites, we've had multiple sites for benefits or for travel privileges. So now we're trying to make everything more concise and have your single spot where everybody can use, they're more familiar with the platforms. And because we've started messaging that this is where you get your single source of truth, this is a platform we've used, going forward, the employees are more familiar with that and the processes that we've created.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Natalie. And then now back to you, Jacqueline, as well. What you referenced certain challenges that come with sourcing a single source of truth, right? Or coming, the insights. And I am willing to guess that you're not alone in this challenge, right? And that as a company and as an individual, in trying to identify, what do you pay attention with, what the executive wants, or going back to, the basics and listening. How do you consolidate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the biggest area of opportunity that we have. I'm just looking at the chat here. That we have yet to invest in. And it's not for my lack of calling attention to it. It's like I've been saying this since I started over 2.5 years ago, and that this was like a massive gaping hole for the organization. And in lieu of a source of truth, you find a lot of people reaching out on Slack, sort of asking people, hey, do you have any research on this? Do you have any data on this? We do have a lot of data scientists. And I personally, I have a data scientist on my team who and he's fantastic. And it's been a real asset to me, and it's given me a lot more data literacy just over the years. And I had a data scientist at Fannie Mae as well. And I will always have a data scientist. I think it's a critical skill.
So you would suggest having a data scientist is important?
Surely, I mean, I think it's important in siloed organizations that are so large and complex that it takes too long. Like I'm trying to reduce dependencies, I guess. And so if I have my own data scientist, I can say, hey, I want to look at this, this, and this paired with this. Can you run a query? And let's see what that looks like. And then we'll look at it together. And then we'll say, okay, well, let's add this and let's remove this. And we'll look at that. And you can keep modifying it together. I mean, it's almost like, imagine a product designer and a developer working next to each other. And the sort of, efficiencies that are created by having the two rapidly iterate on product design. For me, I think of it as this is my opportunity to rapidly iterate on the insight that I need and sort of what it's telling me and how we can quickly make these decisions. And it's just been an asset to have someone who can run these queries and give me a perspective, because we don't have anything like it in the organization.
How do you select a problem to use the design thinking framework for resolution? Right? What is the criteria that we need to look for to qualify a problem for the design thinking approach? This is a good segue to my next question. It's like, oftentimes, more often than not, it doesn't matter how big the company is or how large the organization is, you're always lacking resources, whether it's people or money or technology, right? And we think that design thinking is this messy, long-winded, or research, whatever the case might, that requires time, effort, and commitment. So how do we simplify it? I'm sure we can leave our audience with some simple tips on how do you start? Where do you start? So Jacqueline, since you have your microphone open, what would be a practical advice that you could share with our audience who are trying to bring more of that design thinking into their roles as in customer experience, in employee experience, of course, user experience users there all the time, or whether you're in a brand experience role in marketing, for example?
Yeah, it's funny. When I first saw that question, I was thinking about it, and my initial response was that I sort of, if I look at it through a research lens, and I try to say this within organizations because everyone wants to move quickly. And so I try to think of my responses through that lens. And, if you have a reliable data collection system that allows you to do, fairly rigorous analysis, that you can slice in different ways for different audiences based on the needs, based on what they need to know, that gives you a really good starting point. You can generally formulate hypotheses based on what your data is telling you. And I sort of look at design thinking as, as this opportunity to like if you have it set up well, your data should start to point you in certain directions. It should start to say like, oh, there's something going on here, there's something going on there. And if, and it's totally okay to not immediately know what that something is, but to have a general sense, to be at least in the right area. Like you're in the right neighborhood, you got to find the right house. But like, and I think it's like, so, you've got, if you have that signal, then it's a matter of identifying, okay, well, what is a representative sample of your customers? Okay, well, what is their experience like? Which employees are involved in delivering that experience? Which parts of the organization are involved in managing that or overseeing that? Of the opportunity areas, which one sort of jumps at you or it stands out as like the key opportunity area. And then you're identifying, okay, well, let's get these folks together. Let's get let's see if we can have, you know, I mean, I generally, it's just, it totally, all of this is so dependent on like the organization you work for, the culture. Are you distributed? Are you co-located? Like, are you doing this virtually? Are you doing this in person? Are you in different time zones? Like, there's just all these logistics you have to figure out. But generally, you know, I sort of look to the data as a starting point, and then you can kind of dig deeper using design thinking, and you can sort of say like, all right, let's have, if we're looking at backstage first, then let's bring in all of the folks who are within our organization, who are, you know, either setting up processes or data collection or tooling or training or onboard, whatever it might be, knowledge management, whatever you need to deliver the service. Let's bring them in. Let's clarify the backstage, and then let's do some, you know, and not come to conclusions yet, but just like bookmark that for now, or like put it aside for now, and then like focus on the employee side and sort of like, what's a representative sample of your employees? You know, how do we dig deeper? Are there specific people that we've actually captured in this data that we can reach out to and get them to elaborate more on their experience? And I'd always favor starting there, but I think I've just worked for so many organizations that are so reluctant to like let us go to customers first. So I'm so used to having to start internally and do everything we can internally to see what's there. And then once we've like been like, hey, look, we've done all we can do internally, let's go to customers and do that.
Right.
But if you work for a company that's like very pro customer research and pro co-creation, and like you have very easy access to customers, then please start there. I did want to say one other point if I can. Oh yeah, one key thing that I used at Fannie Mae, which, you know, going from like incredibly stodgy, like financial government institution that had, you know, just nothing modern about it, and bringing these more contemporary ways of working, and just like even the fact that we didn't dress up for work was like a whole thing. And so we just tried to make it incredibly visible. One of the benefits I had is that I worked at headquarters. And so we have two main, I guess there's one in, we have a big office in Dallas, but we also have there's a big office in DC, and there's one in Reston. But the DC office, we put so much on the walls. Like, this is pre, you know, COVID, this is pre all this remote work. Nobody worked remotely, at least in my world at Fannie. We were all at the office. But we put our personas up on the walls. We put we put all of our artifacts up on the walls and allowed people to see them. And we invited people to, like, if it was a persona for our internal employee, we put it near the people who did that job. And we're like, you know, like, mark this up, tell us what's wrong. You know, you have to make it like so easy for people to give you feedback. We had our board of directors walk through, we had our C-suite walk through. We just like were incredibly visual with it all, and almost like a little bit like in your face, but it was more of a welcoming in your face. Like, please, we want your input. We're going to make this really easy for you.
I love that. It's kind of like,
yeah.
Just tap people on their shoulder, is that you're saying too, right? You know, so, or ask internally. Thank you.
Yeah, you just have to make it accessible.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is start with the data that you have, right? You know, inform with data, look at the quality. Sometimes it might not be perfect, but it's a starting point, so that you can actually identify what problems the data might be indicating. And then in tackling it, is you can either start internally or go to your customers to get that input. But what I love about that is that don't work in a silo. It's basically what you're saying, right? It's like bring people together, stuff.
Yeah. Bring in internal experts, like people who are in these roles. And I always try to give people the caveat that you have, your voice is valid if you're speaking of your experience. You know, I think a lot of people try to like represent the voice of the customer or try to represent the voice of someone else. But it's more important to go after, like, I'm going to talk to one of our advisors. It's people are thrown off by it. Like at Shopify, I'll be like, I want to hear about your experience on the front lines. Like, can you find information? How many screens do you have open? You know, what is it like when you're handling 3 chats at once? Or like, you know, and they're so used to being the spokesperson for the customer that they get thrown off when I want to actually hear about their experience.
That's great advice, right? Because sometimes it starts with some basic questions that, and you don't have to be, you know, we think of design thinking and we think, you know, sticky notes all over the wall or something, or this, but sometimes it's pen and paper and go and ask questions too, right? So thank you for that. Natalie, what about you? What would you suggest in regards to where can a customer experience or an employee experience professional who might not be very comfortable in implementing, change management techniques or something, or in design thinking to that matter. What would be a recommendation, or what would be a natural place to start if you don't have a ton of resources and a ton of time?
Yeah, I think, well, actually, a lot of the points that Jacqueline touched on can be translated over to change management and looking at employee experience. So when you talked about finding where your data is and what are the common themes and concerns of people, that'd be the best place to start to figure out where you actually need to address and where you need to make improvements. So those are some of the things like leveraging your change agent group or employees that are across the organization, so you get a representative view of what's going on. You can leverage surveys, focus groups. Yeah, the change agent method is really good because you can get one person that understands how it works, and they can go out into their group and get some really candid information, versus if you go to your manager and have them try to get that information, people are usually a little more reserved in what they're going to give back. So I think, yeah, data is a great place to start. And when we're looking at actually implementing, I think we talked a little bit about before about making sure that we have methods for being agile, having quick communications, so figuring out what channels work for people and what works in their workflow as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, one of the things that I was looking at as well in the principles of design thinking for in times of crisis is saying remove barriers to ask for help. Make it easy for users to ask for help when, where, and how they need it. And you've addressed many of these, in kind of having the focus groups and such, but change is hard for everyone, right? It's as it is, and not everybody absorbs change the same way. And some people might not be as expressing themselves as easily. What are some potential techniques that can be used to eliminate those barriers of, break those, just those barriers and I'm just thinking of the different personas, right? It's very easy. It's like, if you ask me how I feel, I'm like, you know what, I'll share it with you. I'm an open book, right? But some other people are more reserved. So how do you start digging a little deeper than what people are saying?
That's a good question. I think that's something we're definitely still working at WestJet for sure. It takes time to build that trust, but that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I really like the change agent group, because if you're speaking to your employee, you're more likely to get accurate, like employee or colleague to colleague versus manager, if there's some sort of hierarchy. So keeping it really informal. Like when I reach out to my change agents, I'll say, hey, can you get a pulse on what's going on? What is everyone saying around the lunch table? And getting those kind of feedback really helps understand what actually is going on, versus if you send out a survey, there's always is a risk that people aren't going to be as open. Or again, if you're speaking to your manager. One of the other things too that we've started to do is, as we implement things, and this does take a little bit more time, but actually doing some testing with the different user groups and seeing, when you implement a change, how do they access the technology? What device do they access it on? Because when we're sitting at our desk, it's very different than someone who's accessing something on their phone or their tablet. So figuring out how those different groups interact with the change and getting feedback from that has helped us also tailor how we deliver things.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom, your expertise, right, in these areas. And of course, this is both for you, Jacqueline, and Natalie, you're sharing from your own personal experiences here too in your roles. And do you have any final words of advice, to those who might be thinking about, design thinking or human-centric is for the UX team or for, or the research team? Any final words of advice on how to try to start testing it in problem-solving solutions? Jacqueline, do you have any comments?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. The first thing that comes to mind is sort of my own revelation that, if you're trying to bring about change within an organization, and I've spent the last definitely 8 years, more than that if I count my time in the music industry within those types of organizations, but within the design space, I've worked for a number of tech companies and want to be tech companies, that talk a good talk, and they have a lot of nice sounding values, and they have a lot of like, aspirations of being human centered, and I think, I mean, it's interesting. Anyway, one of the things that I've come into realizing is that if you really want to change how the organization works, you want to bring a new capability in to help drive that change, you are doing a disservice to yourself, to your organization, and especially to the people you hire to do that if you don't bring them in at the right level. You will spend if you come in at middle management, you will spend your whole time evangelizing and advocating and just having to show value in small ways to try to help the organization see why this makes sense. And it can be a really, really difficult journey to go on. And I think that if you really want to bring about change, be respectful of your budget, respectful of people you hire, and bring somebody in at a high enough level who has that expertise, and then give them the authority to go make that change happen. Trust them to go do the thing. Peter, if you're curious about an example of this, Peter Meerholtz did an interview with Mark Fontaine for the Service Design Show recently, and he talked about his role, I think at Groupon, and just that was it. Like, he got hired, he had built his credibility as a consultant and was able to use that trust from the industry and get hired at a VP level to go into Groupon and to have a budget and have headcount and have the authority to say, you're not doing this the right way. We're going to change this, this, and this. And then to actually, and it's not like an immediate, like, oh my God, tomorrow everything's different. I mean, it's a gradual thing, but you at least have some sort of like high level thought leadership that can then trickle down and reflect, like, it can be holistic. If you start in middle management in one little silo, my God, it's not going to work. I've been there. I'm there right now. It is painstaking. Like, it is, and then it's just going to further perpetuate the silos. You have to bring it up high enough so that you can see the whole vision. You can get holistic. You can have things connected. And unfortunately, I said that I don't have that authority right now, and it's been incredibly demoralizing and frustrating
I think some folks here might be relating to that. Well, but also, if you're already in a VP level, for those who are listening here, you can think about, again, it's kind of coming to that human-centric design. And there's one principle here, which is about giving power back, to the individual. So really kind of more of being open to those inputs from individuals and such, and also making sure, that your talent is well used in the company, like Steve Jobs says, why we hire people to do jobs and then tell them what to do, right? So, and what about you, Natalie? Any final words of wisdom as well before we open up for some questions, and for Umer to help us, wrap up this session as well?
Yeah, well, when you spoke about trust, Jacqueline, I think that immediately was like, yep, that's a huge problem. And I think, with all the advice that we talk about and we give, there's one thing about doing it, and then another thing about doing it authentically and actually standing behind the product that you put in place, whether that's or the learning or the communication. Because if you reach out, for example, and ask everyone for feedback and they don't see a result, they're not going to want to keep giving your feedback if they feel like that it's just gone into space. So making sure that you follow back, that you loop people in, and that they can actually see how their voice has had an impact is, I think, a huge learning for us. I think about there's a YouTube video where there's someone at a concert and they just start dancing by themselves, and you slowly see more people come in, they start dancing. And so if you kind of take that approach where you go in and you get a couple people on board, and then you can slowly grow that wave across the company, it takes time, but
it's like creating a vibe, right? It's creating a wave. Thank you. That's really helpful advice too. Thank you to both of you, Natalie and Jacqueline, for this time and for taking the time to share your expertise, leaving our audience with some helpful tips. For everyone, before you leave, I know we have a few minutes here. Please feel free to share your comments. I see some of them are sharing comments here too. And before you leave, I want to also give you something from For Experience. You know, we have a gift for everyone who has participated here. I'm going to put it here in the chat. So if you can take a look at it, here's an employee experience kit. It's free. It's completely free. It's our gift to you. It's basically just, if you don't know where to get started, here are a few guidelines, you know, just to refer back with a little checklist on what to consider when you're building an employee feedback system. And again, well, enjoy it. And we hope that that you took some good tips, you know, some good helpful tips for your that you can bring back to your organization as well. And with that, I would love to leave it for Umer, and also please keep asking your questions here too. I see we have some For Experience Roundtable members here too, so thank you for joining us today.
Right, thanks, Corey, and thanks, Jacqueline and Natalie, for the great insights. Really insightful. And thanks to all the participants for joining us. We'd love for you to join our CXPA network. So there's a few ways you can connect with us. You can follow us on LinkedIn, or you can follow us on the CXPA Calgary network page. We will share those links after this session, along with a recording for this session. CXPA membership is free if you want to just participate in the sessions, or if you want to become a paid member, it brings additional benefits that you can enjoy. CXPA, they also offer a CXP certification, which will help you get recognized and be a recognized CX professional, which is what companies are looking for nowadays. We're also welcoming volunteers to join us to further develop the network. So feel free to reach out to me, to Jamur, or Jackie if you're interested in participating. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to see you at future events. Thank you and have a good day.